and the gathering storm, a logistical colossus. Picture, if you will, the English countryside in the spring of 1944. Rolling green fields that had known nothing but sheep and barley for centuries now bore witness to something unprecedented, something that would have seemed impossible just 5 years earlier. In what had once been a pasture near Southampton, wooden crates stretched toward the horizon in perfect geometric rows. Each crate bore cryptic markings: ammo 30 cal stenciled in black paint, rations 10 in 1 stamped on olive drab boxes, medical supplies priority marked in red letters that seemed to pulse with urgency even in the soft English light. The transformation was breathtaking in its scope. Across southern England, from Devon to Kent, the peaceful countryside had become the staging ground for the largest amphibious invasion in human history. But this wasn't just about moving men across the channel. This was about moving an entire civilization's worth of supplies, about creating a logistical miracle that would make the Roman road system look quaint by comparison. Listen, can you hear it? The rhythmic clang of loading cranes working through the dawn mist, the deep rumble of Liberty ships' engines as they arrived daily in Portsmouth Harbour, their holds pregnant with American steel and British determination, the whispered conversations of dock workers who signed papers they couldn't read, moving cargo they couldn't identify, all bound for destinations marked only as forward. The numbers alone were staggering. By May of 1944, the Allied forces had accumulated over 5 million tons of supplies across these improvised depots. 5 million tons. To put that in perspective, that's roughly equivalent to the weight of 400 fully loaded passenger trains. Every single day, another convoy arrived. Every single night, another field disappeared under canvas tarpaulins and wooden crates. But the true genius wasn't in the accumulation, it was in the organization. Each depot was a masterpiece of military logistics, designed by minds that understood that the difference between victory and catastrophe often came down to having the right bullet in the right rifle at the right moment, 2,000 miles from home. Take the ammunition alone. The planners calculated that each infantry division would consume approximately 700 tons of ammunition per day once combat began. Multiply that by the projected number of divisions, factor in the different calibers, the different weapon systems, the naval gunfire support requirements. The mathematics became dizzyingly complex, yet somehow, in these quiet English fields, it all made sense. The smell of canvas and creosote hung heavy in the air. Tarpaulins, thousands upon thousands of them, stretched tight over supplies that represented the industrial might of 2 continents. Beneath those protective covers lay not just the tools of war, but the infrastructure of survival. Medical supplies that could stock 50 hospitals, communications equipment that could connect London to Normandy as easily as calling across the street, engineering materials sufficient to rebuild entire towns. The local population watched this transformation with a mixture of awe and trepidation. Farmers found themselves suddenly wealthy, their fields requisitioned by the government at rates that exceeded a decade's normal income. Children pressed their faces against school windows, watching endless convoys of trucks disappear into what had been their playground just months before. Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell, who kept a small cottage near what became Depot 47, would later write in her diary, "The sound never stops now. Day and night the lorries come and go. Yesterday I counted 67 trucks pass my gate before breakfast. The drivers are so young, some barely look old enough to shave. They wave and smile, but their eyes know something the rest of us can only guess at." Indeed, the drivers knew. The dock workers knew, the crane operators and the inventory clerks and the guards who walked the perimeter fences. They all knew that this accumulation of material represented something far more significant than military preparation. This was democracy itself, transformed into physical form. Every crate of rations was a statement that free nations could organize themselves. Every pallet of medical supplies was a declaration that liberty was worth any sacrifice. The fuel depots were perhaps the most impressive sight of all. Massive rubber bladders, each capable of holding thousands of gallons of aviation gasoline, nestled in carefully excavated depressions. The engineers had calculated that the invasion force would consume fuel at a rate that defied comprehension, nearly 1 million gallons per day once operations commenced. The logistics of simply moving that much petroleum across the Atlantic, then storing it, then distributing it to the right vehicles at the right time. It represented a triumph of planning that rivaled any military victory. But fuel and ammunition were just the beginning. The medical preparations alone revealed the soberness with which Allied planners approached their task. Field hospitals had been prefabricated and packed for rapid deployment. Surgical instruments, enough to equip a major city's hospital system, lay carefully wrapped in sterile packaging. Blood plasma, morphine, sulfur powder. The pharmacological arsenal of 1944 stood ready in climate-controlled storage facilities that had been wheat fields just months earlier. The planners had studied every lesson from previous amphibious operations. They remembered Gallipoli, where inadequate medical support had turned tactical setbacks into strategic disasters. They remembered Dieppe, where the wounded had lain on the beaches for hours without proper care. Those memories drove them to accumulate medical supplies with an almost obsessive thoroughness. Each evening, as the sun set over these transformed landscapes, a profound quiet would settle over the depots. The work crews would finish their shifts, the convoys would park in neat rows, and for a few precious hours, the countryside would almost remember what peace felt like. Almost, but not quite, because even in the silence, the weight of anticipation pressed down like a physical force. The guards who walked the midnight perimeter patrols understood that they weren't just protecting supplies. They were protecting the hopes of occupied Europe. Every crate they guarded contained not just military equipment, but the promise that liberation was coming. The French resistance fighters, hiding in their cellars and forests, were counting on these supplies. The Dutch underground, the Norwegian commandos, the Polish partisans, all of them were represented in these accumulating mountains of material. As spring progressed toward summer, the accumulation reached a crescendo that seemed to defy the laws of physics. How could these small islands possibly contain so much material? How could harbors designed for fishing boats and coastal trading now accommodate the largest ships ever built? How could railway systems laid down in the Victorian era suddenly carry the weight of modern mechanized warfare? The answer lay in the peculiar genius of democratic organization. Unlike totalitarian systems that relied on rigid hierarchies and central control, the Allied logistics effort drew its strength from thousands of individual initiatives. Port workers in Liverpool developed new loading techniques that increased efficiency by 30%. Railway dispatchers in Scotland created scheduling systems that moved twice as many trains with half the delays. Warehouse supervisors in Wales invented inventory methods that eliminated entire categories of waste and confusion. Innovation bloomed in the most unexpected places. A dock worker in Plymouth suggested a modification to cargo nets that saved precious minutes in loading operations. A secretary in London developed a filing system that allowed supply officers to locate specific items among millions of inventory entries in seconds rather than hours. A truck driver in Bristol proposed a route modification that eliminated dangerous bottlenecks during peak traffic periods. Each innovation, taken alone, might have seemed trivial, but multiplied across thousands of operations, repeated hundreds of times per day, these small improvements accumulated into something approaching logistical perfection. The democratic spirit that the Allies were fighting to preserve had somehow manifested itself in the very process of preparation for battle. And still the supplies came. As May turned toward June, the depots reached a state of readiness that bordered on the surreal. Everything that human ingenuity could provide, that industrial capacity could produce, that transportation networks could deliver. It all lay waiting in the English countryside, organized with a precision that would have impressed the most demanding peacetime corporation. The men who would soon depend on these supplies were completing their training in camps scattered across Britain. They practiced with the weapons that lay crated in the depots. They studied maps of beaches that would soon be littered with the medical supplies now stored under canvas. They wrote letters home on paper that had been manufactured in the same factories that produced the communication equipment destined for Normandy. Everything was connected. Everything was ready. The greatest logistical achievement in military history lay spread across the English countryside, waiting for a weather window and a commander's decision. The gathering storm was nearly complete. Embarkation. The journey begins. The decision came at 04:15 hours on June 5th. Eisenhower, studying the latest meteorological reports in the map room at Southwick House, saw what his weathermen had promised: a narrow window. 36 hours of marginally acceptable conditions. Not good weather, but survivable weather. The kind of calculated risk that separates great commanders from cautious ones. "Okay, let's go," he said simply. Two words that set in motion the largest seaborne invasion in human history. Within hours, the embarkation orders rippled outward through the command structure. From corps headquarters to regimental command posts, from company commanders to platoon sergeants. The machinery of war, so carefully calibrated over months of preparation, began its final, irreversible sequence. At Portsmouth Harbour, Staff Sergeant Michael O'Brien of the 1st Infantry Division felt the deck plates vibrate beneath his boots as the diesel engines of landing craft Tank 947 rumbled to life. The sound was different from the trucks and generators he'd grown accustomed to. Deeper, more purposeful, this was the sound of departure. O'Brien had been through the embarkation drills a dozen times during the spring exercises. But this morning, watching the Sherman tank ahead of him inch forward onto the steel ramp, he knew this was no drill. The tank crews weren't joking about seasickness anymore. The Navy coxswains weren't making small talk about the weather. The LCT 947 was a marvel of utilitarian engineering. 120 feet of welded steel designed for one purpose: delivering 30-ton Sherman tanks directly onto enemy beaches. Her shallow draft allowed her to beach in just 3 feet of water. Her bow doors could drop away in seconds, creating an instant bridge between ship and shore. She was ugly, ungainly, and absolutely essential. Loading proceeded with mechanical precision. Each Sherman tank represented not just 30 tons of armor and firepower, but weeks of preparation. The crews had waterproofed their engines with special compounds, sealed every electrical connection, and painted white stripes on their rear decks for aerial identification. Extra ammunition was secured in waterproof containers. Radio frequencies had been tested and retested. Behind the tanks came the infantry, O'Brien's men from Charlie Company, 16th Infantry Regiment. Each soldier carried 68 pounds of equipment. Not the theoretical load from the training manuals, but the actual weight they'd measured and remeasured. Ammunition, rations, medical supplies, demolition charges, spare radio batteries. Everything they might need to survive the first 48 hours in Nazi-occupied Europe. The loading bay of the LCT became a study in controlled chaos. Sergeants counted heads and checked equipment manifests. Navy personnel secured vehicles with chains and turnbuckles, knowing that a single loose tank in heavy seas could punch through the hull. Medical corpsmen distributed seasickness pills and checked their aid bags one final time. Private First Class Tommy Kowalski, 19 years old and from Detroit, found himself pressed against the starboard bulkhead as more equipment came aboard. His rifle, an M1 Garand that had become as familiar as his own hands, was slung across his back. In his field pack were letters from home, a rosary his mother had given him, and a small notebook where he'd been trying to record his thoughts about the war. The notebook remained blank. How do you write about something that hasn't happened yet? How do you describe fear that sits in your stomach like a cold stone, mixed with excitement that makes your hands shake slightly when you think no one is looking? Around him, his squadmates dealt with the waiting in their own ways. Sergeant Murphy cleaned his Thompson submachine gun for the 3rd time that morning, field stripping and reassembling the weapon with practiced efficiency. Corporal Anderson studied aerial photographs of Omaha Beach, memorizing landmarks he hoped to recognize through smoke and chaos. The LCT's crew worked with quiet professionalism. Coxswain First Class Robert Hayes had been running landing craft since the North Africa invasion. He understood the delicate balance required to beach these vessels. Too fast, and you'd damage the bow doors. Too slow, and you'd become a stationary target. He'd practiced the approach to Omaha Beach on similar coastlines across southern England, timing his runs, calculating angles of approach. As the morning progressed, the harbour filled with similar scenes multiplied across dozens of vessels. LSTs, landing ships tank, each capable of carrying 20 Sherman tanks and their crews. LCIs, landing craft infantry, designed to deliver 200 soldiers directly onto the beach. And the larger transports, the converted passenger liners and cargo ships that would anchor offshore and transfer their human cargo to smaller vessels for the final run to the beach. The logistics were staggering. Each LCT required specific loading sequences to maintain proper trim and balance. Fuel tanks had to be calculated to provide sufficient range while leaving room for personnel and equipment. Fresh water, medical supplies, ammunition, everything had to be positioned for maximum efficiency and minimum vulnerability. By noon, LCT 947 was loaded and ready. 4 Sherman tanks, their crews, and 43 infantrymen from Charlie Company. The vessel sat low in the water, heavy with the weight of war. Her engines idled steadily, waiting for the signal to join the massive convoy forming in the Solent. O'Brien found a moment of quiet near the stern, looking back at the English coast. Portsmouth Harbour was alive with activity. Hundreds of vessels in various stages of loading and preparation. Barrage balloons floated overhead like silver sentinels, their cables designed to snare any German aircraft that might attempt to disrupt the embarkation. The scale was overwhelming. From his position on the water, O'Brien could see only a fraction of the invasion force, yet it stretched beyond the horizon. Somewhere out there were the paratroopers who would jump behind enemy lines, the rangers who would scale the cliffs at Pointe du Hoc, the engineers who would clear beach obstacles under fire, the medics who would tend the wounded, the 1,000 small units that would somehow coordinate into a single overwhelming assault. The waiting was perhaps the hardest part. Once the shooting started, training would take over. Muscle memory and instinct would guide them through whatever came next. But here, in the cramped confines of the landing craft, there was nothing to do but think. About home, about the mission ahead, about the friends who might not see another sunset. As afternoon faded toward evening, the signal flags went up. The convoy would depart with the tide. Engines increased their tempo, mooring lines were cast off. The Great Armada began to move. LCT 947 took her place in the formation, one vessel among thousands. Her wake joined the countless others, white foam spreading across the dark water of the English Channel. Behind them, the coast of England slowly receded. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and the beaches of Normandy. The journey had begun. There was no turning back now. Across the Channel, a sea of uncertainty. The first hour passed in relative calm. The convoy maintained its formation as it moved through the familiar waters off the English coast, destroyers and corvettes maintaining their protective screen around the vulnerable landing craft. The sea state was moderate, choppy enough to remind everyone they were no longer on solid ground, but not yet the punishing conditions that would test both equipment and resolve. Inside LCT 947, the initial excitement of departure had given way to something more subdued. The diesel engines maintained their steady thrum beneath the deck plating, a mechanical heartbeat that seemed to synchronize with the rhythm of the waves. The air grew thick with the smell of fuel, salt spray, and something else. The particular odor of too many men in too small a space, already beginning to feel the effects of the Channel's notorious motion. Private Henderson had found a spot near the starboard rail where he could see patches of sky through the open well deck. The landing craft's flat bottom made it particularly susceptible to the wave action, and what had seemed like gentle swells from the dock now translated into a persistent rolling motion that seemed to catch his stomach off guard with each cycle. He wasn't alone in his discomfort. The Royal Navy had warned them about this. The LSTs and larger transports would provide a more stable platform, but the smaller landing craft, these were designed for one purpose: getting men and equipment from ship to shore. Comfort during the crossing was a secondary consideration at best. Sergeant Morrison moved among his men, checking equipment, offering quiet words of encouragement. He'd crossed the Channel before, during the evacuation from Dunkirk 4 years earlier. Different circumstances entirely, but the same stretch of water, the same unpredictable conditions. He knew what lay ahead, both in terms of the crossing and what waited on the far shore. "Keep your gear secure," he reminded them, his voice carrying over the engine noise. "And if you're going to be sick, use the buckets. We'll need this deck space clean when we reach the other side." The buckets, standard equipment on every landing craft, positioned strategically throughout the troop compartments. The Navy had learned from experience. Seasickness wasn't just a matter of discomfort, it was a tactical consideration. Men who arrived at the beach dehydrated and weakened would be less effective in the critical first hours of the assault. As the convoy moved deeper into the channel, the protective presence of the Royal Navy became more evident. Destroyers swept ahead and to the flanks, their sonar operators listening for the telltale sounds of German U-boats. The Kriegsmarine still maintained a submarine presence in these waters, though nothing like the wolf packs that had terrorized Atlantic convoys earlier in the war. Admiral Ramsay's naval planners had spent months developing the route and timing for this crossing. 10 distinct channels had been swept clear of mines, marked with danbuoys, and designated for different types of vessels. The slower landing craft would follow the longer routes, while the faster transports could take more direct paths. It was a masterpiece of naval choreography, assuming everyone maintained their assigned positions and timing. The weather remained the wild card. Eisenhower's decision to proceed on June 6 had been based on a narrow window of improved conditions predicted by his meteorological team. But weather prediction in 1944 was still more art than science, particularly over the volatile waters of the English Channel. The barometric pressure continued to fluctuate, and the wind patterns showed signs of the larger storm system that had forced the initial postponement. By the second hour, the motion had claimed its first casualties among Henderson's squad. Collins, the youngest member of their group, had given up any pretense of maintaining his composure and was hunched over one of the Navy's thoughtfully provided buckets. The green tinge to his complexion was visible even in the dim lighting of the troop compartment. "First time across?" Morrison asked, settling beside the young soldier. Collins could only nod, not trusting himself to speak. "It gets easier," Morrison lied kindly. "Focus on the horizon when you can see it. And remember, the Germans are dealing with the same conditions we are." This was actually true, though perhaps not in the way Morrison intended. The German coastal defenses had been designed primarily to repel an invasion during optimal weather conditions. Rough seas and poor visibility would complicate their defensive fire control just as much as it challenged the Allied assault forces. Rommel's beach obstacles were most effective at high tide, but the choppy conditions would make it harder for German artillery observers to direct accurate fire on the approaching landing craft. The convoy pressed on through the darkness. Navigation lights were forbidden. Any illumination could betray their position to German reconnaissance aircraft or U-boats. The coxswains relied on compass bearings, dead reckoning, and the occasional glimpse of the guide vessels ahead to maintain their course. It required skill and nerve, piloting a loaded landing craft through these waters in complete darkness while maintaining formation with hundreds of other vessels. Above them, the sound of aircraft engines provided a constant reminder of the air umbrella protecting the invasion fleet. RAF Fighter Command had committed virtually every available squadron to maintaining air superiority over the channel during the crossing. The Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former strength, but even a few German bombers breaking through the fighter screen could wreak havoc among the tightly packed convoy. Henderson found himself thinking about the intelligence briefings they'd received before embarkation. The planners had been remarkably thorough in their preparations, but everyone knew that no plan survived first contact with the enemy. The German defensive positions at Omaha Beach were formidable. Concrete bunkers, interlocking fields of fire, obstacles designed to channel attacking forces into predetermined killing zones. What they didn't know was how many of those positions would be manned when they arrived. German intelligence had failed to detect the true timing and location of the invasion, but that didn't mean the coastal defenders would be caught completely off guard. The sound of the approaching fleet would be audible from shore long before the landing craft reached the beach. The third hour brought heavier seas, the wind had picked up, and the landing craft's motion became more pronounced. Even experienced sailors began to feel the effects. The careful stowage of equipment became critical as unsecured items began to shift with each roll of the vessel. Morrison checked his watch. Still hours to go before they would see the French coast. The naval timetable called for the landing craft to reach their designated positions just as dawn broke, providing enough light for the final approach while giving the supporting naval gunfire maximum effectiveness against the German positions. In the darkness around them, thousands of other vessels maintained the same steady progress toward Normandy. Battleships and cruisers carrying the heavy guns that would soften the beach defenses. Destroyers ready to provide close fire support, minesweepers clearing the final approaches, transport ships carrying the follow-on forces that would exploit whatever foothold the first wave could establish. The greatest seaborne invasion in history was halfway across the English Channel, committed now to a course of action that would reshape the war and the world beyond it. Securing the beachhead, the first supplies ashore. Dawn was breaking over the Norman coast as the first landing craft ground against the shingle and sand of the invasion beaches. The theoretical had become brutally real. The carefully planned logistics of Operation Overlord now faced their ultimate test in the chaos of actual combat. On Omaha Beach, where the fighting had been fiercest, the first priority wasn't territory, it was ammunition. Companies of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions had expended their basic loads fighting through the German defensive positions. Without resupply, the hard-won foothold would become untenable within hours. Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison of the 1st Division's logistics staff waded through knee-deep surf, his waterproof map case held high above the waves. Behind him, a string of WW2 amphibious vehicles churned through the breakers, their cargo holds packed with wooden crates marked in white stencil. Cartridges, ball, Cal-30, and grenades, fragmentation, Mk2. The beach presented a scene of controlled pandemonium. Scattered equipment from the initial assault littered the sand, abandoned packs, discarded life preservers, the twisted wreckage of obstacles cleared by the engineers. But already the beach was transforming from a battlefield into a supply depot. Morrison's men had studied aerial photographs of these beaches for months, memorizing every contour and landmark. Now they implemented Beach Maintenance Plan 7, the systematic organization of supply dumps according to a grid system that would allow units to find their materials even in the confusion of combat. The first ammunition dump took shape 50 yards inland from the high water mark. Wooden crates stacked in precise rows, separated by type and caliber. The methodical approach seemed almost absurd given the circumstances, but this was how armies sustained themselves in battle. Organization imposed on chaos. A mile offshore, the cargo ship SS James Parker had dropped anchor in the transport area. Her holds contained the sinews of war, not just ammunition, but medical supplies, communications equipment, rations, and the 1,000 mundane items that modern armies consumed at prodigious rates. Captain Sarah Mitchell of the Army Nurse Corps supervised the loading of medical supplies into an LCVP landing craft. Plasma containers packed in ice, surgical instruments wrapped in sterile cloth, morphine syrettes by the hundreds. The 1st Infantry Division's aid stations were reporting critical shortages. Wounded men were receiving treatment, but the medics needed resupply to continue their work. The landing craft's coxswain, Petty Officer 2nd Class Rodriguez, had been making runs to the beach since 0700 hours. Each trip brought its own challenges. Navigating between the larger vessels anchored offshore, timing the approach to avoid the worst of the surf, finding a clear section of beach for unloading. Rodriguez had developed his own system. He watched the wave patterns, counting the sets. 7 smaller waves, followed by 3 larger ones, then a brief lull. In that lull, he could beach his craft and begin the frantic process of unloading before the next set arrived. The medical supplies went ashore in canvas stretchers, carried by teams of soldiers who had been detailed from their units for beach duty. These men understood the urgency. Their comrades inland depended on this lifeline of supply. By 0900 hours, the character of the beach was changing rapidly. Engineer battalions had cleared lanes through the remaining obstacles, marking safe passages with white tape. Shorefire control parties had established communication with the destroyers offshore, coordinating naval gunfire support for units pushing inland. But it was the supply operation that truly secured the beachhead. Colonel William Harrison, the beach commander for this sector, moved between the growing dumps of equipment and supplies. His job was to orchestrate the flow of materials from ship to shore to fighting unit, a complex dance of priorities and logistics. Harrison's biggest challenge wasn't German resistance, it was traffic control. Landing craft queued offshore, waiting their turn to beach. Vehicles and men crowded the narrow exits from the beach. Supplies accumulated faster than they could be moved inland. The solution came from months of planning and rehearsal. Beach parties, specially trained units whose sole job was managing the supply flow. Implemented procedures practiced on English beaches throughout the spring. traffic control points, designated unloading areas, priority systems for critical supplies. First priority, ammunition and medical supplies. Second, communications equipment and engineer tools. Third, rations and water. Everything else would wait until the beachhead was secure. The human cost of this supply operation rarely appeared in the official histories. Seaman First Class Thompson of LST 325 had been unloading trucks since dawn, his hands raw from handling steel cables and cargo nets. The adrenaline of the assault had faded. Now came the grinding work of sustaining an army in hostile territory. Thompson's ship had crossed the channel loaded with vehicles, jeeps, trucks, artillery pieces, and the specialized equipment that mechanized armies required. Each vehicle had to be precisely positioned for unloading, engines started and warmed, then driven down the ship's ramp onto the beach. The LST's bow doors had opened like the mouth of some mechanical whale, revealing the ordered rows of vehicles within. Tank crews and truck drivers who had spent the crossing below decks now emerged into the morning light of occupied France. Lieutenant Patricia Williams, one of the few women to participate directly in the D-Day landings, coordinated the unloading from her position on LST 325's bridge. As a Navy communications specialist, she managed the radio traffic between ship and shore, a constant stream of requests, confirmations, and updates on the supply situation. Her logbook for June 6th recorded the systematic transfer of Allied combat power onto European soil. 0830, first truck convoy departed for ammunition dump. 845, medical jeep dispatched to 1st Division aid station. 0900, artillery battery moving inland to firing positions. The establishment of supply dumps represented more than military necessity. It was a statement of intent. The Allies had come to stay. Each crate of ammunition, each case of rations, each jerry can of gasoline represented commitment to the liberation of Europe. By midday, the beach resembled a vast outdoor warehouse. Ammunition dumps grew into small mountains of wooden crates. Medical supplies filled a requisitioned German bunker. Fuel dumps, carefully separated and camouflaged, began accumulating the gasoline that would power the advance inland. The German defenders, falling back from their coastal positions, could see the evidence of Allied determination. This wasn't a raid to be repelled. It was an invasion supported by the full industrial might of the democratic nations. Staff Sergeant Martinez of the 1st Division's supply company supervised the distribution of rations to units moving inland. His men loaded jeep trailers with cases of K rations and D rations, the concentrated foods that would sustain American soldiers as they pushed toward their D-Day objectives. The work continued under sporadic German artillery fire, but the supply operation never stopped. When shells fell near the ammunition dump, the handlers took cover, then returned to their work. The beachhead's survival depended on this steady flow of materials from ship to shore to fighting unit. As afternoon approached, the success of the supply operation became evident in the reports filtering back from inland units. Companies that had landed with basic combat loads now had sufficient ammunition for sustained operations. Aid stations had the medical supplies needed to treat casualties. Communications units could maintain contact between scattered elements. The logistics of liberation had taken root on Norman soil, transforming a contested beach into the foundation of Allied victory in Western Europe. The Red Ball Express, a lifeline to the front. By August 1944, as Allied forces pushed deeper into France, that carefully established supply network faced its greatest test. The rapid advance beyond the Normandy beachhead had outpaced the original logistical plans. Cherbourg's port, finally cleared of German demolitions, could receive the massive cargo ships. But getting those supplies to Patton's Third Army, racing toward Paris, required something unprecedented. The solution became known as the Red Ball Express, a convoy system that would transform the roads of France into America's longest supply line. Staff Sergeant William Hayes adjusted his grip on the steering wheel of the 2.5-ton GMC truck, feeling the familiar vibration through the worn leather of his gloves. The pre-dawn darkness of August 25th stretched across the French countryside, broken only by the dim blackout lights of the convoy ahead. 47 trucks in this particular column, each loaded with 5 tons of ammunition, fuel, and rations destined for the front lines now pushing beyond Chartres. Hayes had been driving this route for 3 weeks now, Cherbourg to the forward supply dumps, a round trip of nearly 400 miles over roads never designed for this kind of punishment. The Germans had built these highways for their own logistics, but they hadn't anticipated the sheer volume of American industrial might that would thunder across the Norman countryside. The truck ahead of him hit another pothole, its taillights bouncing violently. Hayes downshifted, feeling the weight of his cargo shift slightly in the bed behind him. 10,000 rounds of .30 caliber ammunition, cases of sea rations, jerry cans of precious gasoline. Everything the advancing infantry needed to maintain their momentum against a retreating but still dangerous enemy. The Red Ball Express operated on a schedule that defied normal military routine. Convoys rolled 20 hours a day, drivers taking brief rests at designated points before climbing back behind the wheel. The one-way traffic system stretched across hundreds of miles of French roads, carefully marked with Red Bull symbols that gave the operation its name. No civilian traffic, no other military vehicles unless specifically authorized. Just an endless stream of American trucks carrying the sinews of war. Hayes glanced at his watch in the faint glow of the dashboard. 0430 hours. They'd left Cherbourg at midnight, should reach the forward dump by noon if the roads stayed clear, if no German aircraft appeared, if no saboteurs had mined the bridges during the night. The variables were endless, but the schedule was sacred. Behind him, Private Johnson fought to stay awake in the passenger seat. The 19-year-old from Alabama had been assigned as Hayes's assistant driver just 2 days ago, still learning the rhythm of these marathon runs. Johnson's job was to watch for trouble, to help with mechanical problems, and to take over if Hayes became too exhausted to continue safely. "Sergeant," Johnson murmured, pointing ahead, "looks like we're slowing down." The convoy was indeed decelerating, brake lights flickering like red fireflies in the darkness. Hayes could see the lead vehicles pulling to the side of the road, standard procedure when encountering obstacles or potential threats. The halt stretched for 20 minutes. Hayes climbed down from his cab, walking forward along the column to investigate. Other drivers were doing the same, stretching legs cramped from hours behind the wheel. The camaraderie among Red Bull drivers transcended the usual military hierarchies. Black and white soldiers worked side by side, united by the shared dangers and exhaustion of keeping the front lines supplied. Corporal Martinez from the lead truck jogged back with information. "Bridge inspection ahead," he called out. "Engineers are checking for damage, should be moving again soon." Hayes nodded, taking the opportunity to walk around his vehicle. The tires showed significant wear, inevitable given the loads they carried and the rough roads they traveled. The engine ran hot, but within acceptable limits. These GMC trucks were proving remarkably durable, designed for American highways but adapting well to European warfare. The mechanical challenges were constant. Broken axles from overloading, blown tires from road debris, overheated engines from the relentless pace. But the maintenance crews performed miracles, keeping the trucks rolling with salvaged parts and improvised repairs. Every vehicle that broke down meant delays in getting supplies forward, delays that could cost lives at the front. As the convoy resumed movement, dawn began to break over the French countryside. Hayes could see the landscape more clearly now. Farmland scarred by recent combat, burned-out German vehicles in the ditches, shell holes in the fields, the physical evidence of the Wehrmacht's retreat, and the advancing Allied pursuit. The daylight brought new dangers. German aircraft, though increasingly rare, still posed a threat to the exposed convoys. Luftwaffe fighters could appear without warning, strafing the roads and targeting the vulnerable supply trucks. Standard procedure called for immediate dispersal, drivers pulling off the roads and taking cover until the threat passed. But the greater danger came from the roads themselves. French highways, built for peacetime traffic, were disintegrating under the constant pounding of heavy military vehicles. Bridges groaned under loads they were never designed to carry. Culverts collapsed from the vibration of endless convoys. The engineers worked frantically to maintain the routes, but the wear was cumulative and relentless. Hayes downshifted again as the convoy climbed a steep grade outside Bayeux. The engine labored under the load, temperature gauge climbing toward the red zone. He eased off the accelerator slightly, balancing the need for speed against the risk of mechanical failure. Experience had taught him to read his truck's moods, to sense when the vehicle was approaching its limits. The human cost of the Red Ball Express was measured not just in combat casualties, but in exhaustion and stress. Drivers routinely worked 18-hour shifts, catching brief naps at supply points before beginning the return journey. The constant vibration and noise took a physical toll. The responsibility of carrying critical supplies created psychological pressure. Every delay, every breakdown, every wrong turn potentially affected soldiers fighting for their lives. Yet the statistics told the story of success. In its first week of operation, the Red Ball Express delivered over 12,000 tons of supplies to the front lines. By September, that figure would double. The system moved everything from artillery shells to medical plasma, from tank parts to mail from home. It became the circulatory system of the Allied advance, pumping the lifeblood of modern warfare across hundreds of miles of contested territory. As Hayes's convoy approached the forward supply dump near Chartres, he could see the organized chaos of a major logistics operation, trucks arriving and departing in carefully choreographed sequence, stevedore units unloading cargo with practiced efficiency, military police directing traffic and maintaining security, fuel trucks topping off empty tanks for the return journey to Cherbourg. The unloading process took less than an hour. Hayes watched as his cargo was transferred to smaller vehicles for distribution to frontline units. Those 10,000 rounds of ammunition might be fired by evening. The rations would feed soldiers advancing toward the German border. The gasoline would power tanks and trucks in tomorrow's offensive operations. By late afternoon, Hayes was back on the road toward Cherbourg, his empty truck riding high and responsive after hours of fighting the weight of a full load. The return journey offered different challenges. Empty vehicles were more vulnerable to crosswinds. The lighter weight meant less traction on steep grades, but the reduced load also meant better fuel economy and slightly less stress on the overworked mechanical components. The Red Ball Express would continue operating until November, when the capture of Antwerp finally provided a closer port for supply operations. But during those crucial months of summer and early autumn, it represented something uniquely American: the application of industrial logistics to military necessity. The same organizational principles that had built the transcontinental railroads and the assembly lines of Detroit now applied to the liberation of Europe. As darkness fell over the Norman countryside once again, Hayes prepared for another night run, another link in the chain that connected American industrial might to Allied victory. Harcard, ingenious solutions, Mulberry Harbors, and Pluto. But while Hayes and his fellow drivers maintained the lifeline across land, an even more audacious engineering challenge had been quietly unfolding beneath the waters of the English Channel itself. In the depths where German U-boats had once prowled, British engineers were laying the foundation for one of the war's most ingenious logistical solutions, a pipeline that would carry the lifeblood of mechanized warfare directly from England to France. Operation Pluto. Pipelines under the ocean represented the kind of thinking that separated Allied logistics from mere supply management. It was industrial ambition married to military necessity, wrapped in secrecy so complete that even many senior officers remained unaware of its existence. The concept had emerged from a simple yet profound realization: fuel was the bottleneck that could strangle victory. Every tank, every truck, every aircraft required petroleum products in quantities that staggered the imagination. A single armored division consumed more fuel in a day of combat than a small city used in a month. Transporting this fuel by tanker ship and truck convoy was not just inefficient, it was vulnerable. Lord Louis Mountbatten had championed the pipeline concept with characteristic audacity. Why not, he had asked his engineers, simply pipe the fuel directly across the channel? The question seemed almost childlike in its simplicity. The engineering reality proved monumentally complex. The pipeline itself was a marvel of wartime innovation. 20 miles of specially designed steel tubing, flexible enough to withstand the channel's tidal forces, yet strong enough to maintain pressure across the seabed. Each section had been manufactured in British factories, working around the clock, then transported to the coast under cover of darkness. The laying operation required precision that bordered on the miraculous. HMS Holdfast, A converted cable-laying ship had spooled out the pipeline like thread from a massive bobbin. But this was no simple cable drop. The pipeline had to follow precise contours of the channel floor, avoiding underwater obstacles that could rupture the line while maintaining the exact depth and angle necessary for proper flow. Captain Morrison, the Royal Navy engineer overseeing the operation, had described the challenge with characteristic British understatement. Rather like threading a needle in the dark while riding a bicycle. The reality was more complex still. Tidal calculations, water pressure differentials, thermal expansion coefficients, every variable had to be calculated and recalculated. As the pipeline snaked its way across the channel floor, another engineering miracle was taking shape along the Normandy coast. The Mulberry harbours, artificial ports that would have impressed the Romans, were rising from the sea itself. The problem had been obvious from the beginning. The Germans controlled every major port along the Atlantic coast. Cherbourg was heavily fortified. Le Havre, Calais, Dunkirk, all bristled with coastal guns and concrete emplacements. Yet the invasion force would require port facilities capable of handling the cargo equivalent of a major commercial harbour. Every single day. Churchill himself had posed the solution with typical directness. "If we cannot capture a port," he had declared, "we shall take one with us." The statement had seemed almost whimsical. The engineering that followed was anything but. The Mulberry concept required reimagining the very nature of harbour construction. Instead of building permanent stone and concrete structures over years of labour, British engineers designed modular components that could be towed across the channel and assembled in position. Massive concrete caissons, each the size of a 5-story building, would form the harbour walls. Floating roadways would connect these artificial breakwaters to the shore. The scale defied comprehension. Each concrete caisson weighed over 6,000 tons. They had been constructed in dry docks across southern England, then carefully flooded and towed to position by fleets of tugboats. The operation required timing so precise that tidal charts had been calculated months in advance. Major Richardson, the Army engineer responsible for Mulberry B at Arromanches, had watched the first caissons being positioned with something approaching awe. Like watching cities being born from the sea, he later wrote. The concrete giants, riding low in the water, were maneuvered into position by teams of tugboat captains whose skill rivaled any harbour pilots. The assembly process itself resembled some vast underwater construction project. Divers worked in the murky channel waters, guiding cables and positioning anchors. Above them, crane operators swung massive steel sections into place with millimeter precision. The floating roadways, constructed of steel and concrete pontoons, had to flex with the tides while supporting the weight of fully loaded trucks. Within days of D-Day, the artificial harbours were handling cargo volumes that exceeded many established ports. Liberty ships and LSTs queued in orderly lines, waiting their turn at the artificial piers. Trucks rolled directly from shipholds onto the floating roadways, then across to the Norman beaches, a continuous conveyor belt of supplies flowing from ship to shore. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of both Pluto and the Mulberry harbours was their impermanence. These were not monuments to engineering pride built to last centuries. They were tools, sophisticated, expensive, ingenious tools designed for a single purpose: victory. The pipeline pumped its first fuel on August 12, 1944. High-octane aviation gasoline flowed silently beneath the channel waters, emerging at pumping stations disguised as innocent coastal installations. The fuel that had traveled 20 miles underwater was soon powering Spitfires and Mustangs over occupied Europe. The Mulberry harbours handled over 2.5 million tons of supplies before winter storms finally claimed Mulberry A. Mulberry B at Arromanches continued operations well into 1945, its concrete caissons still visible today. Monuments to engineering audacity. Yet both achievements shared a deeper significance that transcended their immediate military value. They represented the application of peacetime innovation to wartime necessity. The cable-laying techniques that created Pluto would later span oceans with communication lines. The modular construction principles of the Mulberry harbours would revolutionize offshore engineering. In the quiet hours after midnight, as Pluto's pumps hummed beneath the channel and trucks rolled across the floating roadways of Arromanches, the true measure of Allied logistics became clear. It was not simply the movement of supplies or the construction of facilities, it was the transformation of impossible challenges into engineering solutions, the conversion of industrial imagination into military reality. The liberation of Europe rested not just on the courage of soldiers, but on the ingenuity of engineers who dared to pipe fuel beneath the sea and build harbors from dreams. The echoes of Overlord, a legacy of logistics. The liberation of Europe rested not just on the courage of soldiers, but on the ingenuity of engineers who dared to pipe fuel beneath the sea and build harbors from dreams. And in the quiet years that followed, as the Channel waters returned to their ancient rhythms, as the Norman beaches welcomed children building sandcastles where once landing craft had thundered ashore, the echoes of that great endeavor settled into memory like sediment in still water. The fields of southern England, no longer crowded with ammunition dumps and fuel depots, breathed again with wheat and barley. Yet something profound lingered in that soil, something that spoke of human determination transformed into victory. Walk today through those same Hampshire meadows where once 1,000,000 tons of supplies waited under canvas. Listen to the wind moving through hedgerows that once concealed the greatest logistical operation in history, and you might still sense the ghost of that magnificent effort. The quartermaster sergeants checking their endless inventories, the dockworkers whose calloused hands loaded Liberty ships through countless nights, the engineers who calculated fuel flow rates while bombs fell around them, all of them now part of the eternal conversation between earth and sky. The Red Ball Express highways have returned to peaceful country roads, where farmers drive tractors along routes once thundering with supply convoys racing against time and enemy fire. The ports of Cherbourg and Le Havre handle cargo ships again, their cranes lifting containers instead of ammunition, their docks busy with commerce rather than the desperate urgency of war. Yet in the rhythm of their work, in the careful choreography of loading and unloading, echoes remain of those frantic days when every ton of supplies meant another mile toward freedom. Beneath the channel, where Pluto's pipelines once carried the lifeblood of mechanized armies, fishing boats now drift peacefully above, their nets passing unknowingly over the remnants of engineering audacity. The artificial harbors have long since been claimed by tide and storm, their concrete caissons scattered like monuments to human ingenuity. Home now to schools of fish that swim through chambers once filled with the sound of unloading ships. But perhaps the truest monument to Operation Overlord's logistical triumph lies not in any physical remnant, but in the quiet understanding that ordinary people, faced with extraordinary challenges, can accomplish the impossible. The clerk who tracked 10,000 different supply items, the truck driver who navigated blacked-out roads through enemy territory, the engineer who solved problems that had never existed before, each of them part of a vast human symphony that played the music of liberation across a continent. Their legacy lives on in every complex endeavor that seems too large, too difficult, too ambitious to succeed. In every moment when human beings look at an impossible challenge and decide to break it down into manageable pieces, to organize, to plan, to persist with methodical determination until the impossible becomes inevitable. As sleep settles over the countryside tonight, over the same fields where once the fate of democracy was organized and catalogued and loaded onto ships, the wind carries with it the whispered gratitude of generations who inherited freedom, who walk in safety through a world made possible by those who dared to believe that logistics could become liberation, that careful planning could become courage, and that the patient work of supply and organization could ultimately write the greatest victory in the long story of human freedom.